September 7, 1940, 11:47 p.m., RAF Hornchurch, Essex, England. Flight Lieutenant Peter Wentworth stood in the middle of what should have been a runway, holding a tin bucket filled with white powder that smelled like a schoolroom. Above him, the sound of Heinkel engines grew louder. Maybe 40 bombers, maybe more. The actual runway lay 600 yards to the east, lined with Spitfires that represented Britain's entire fighter defense for this sector. If the Luftwaffe bombers found those planes on the ground, the war could be over by morning. Wentworth had exactly 90 seconds to finish painting lines on empty grass with children's blackboard chalk, creating a runway that existed only in moonlight and German imagination. Before we continue with Peter Wentworth's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to RAF Hornchurch, September 7th, 1940, where Peter Wentworth was about to test whether imagination could stop high explosives. The problem had started 3 weeks earlier, on August 15th, when the Luftwaffe began systematic night bombing of RAF airfields across southern England. Between August 15th and September 6, 1940, the Germans destroyed 466 British aircraft on the ground, not in dogfights, not in heroic combat, but sitting helpless on runways while pilots slept or scrambled too late. 47 airfields suffered major damage. At that rate of attrition, RAF Fighter Command would cease to exist by October 1st. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Peter Wentworth was 26 years old, 5'7", from a village called Nettlebed in Oxfordshire, where his father ran a printing shop. Before the war, Peter had studied architecture at Cambridge for 2 years before money ran out. He joined the RAF in 1938 as a logistics officer, not a pilot. His eyesight wasn't good enough for fighters. They assigned him to RAF Hornchurch as assistant airfield engineer, which meant he spent his days repairing bomb craters, filling potholes, and trying to keep runways flat enough that Spitfires wouldn't cartwheel on landing. His best friend was squadron leader James Holloway, 31, from Edinburgh, who flew Spitfire Mark IIs with 65 Squadron. Holloway had a wife named Margaret and a 4-year-old daughter named Elizabeth. He kept a photograph of them both in his cockpit, tucked behind the gun sight. Holloway and Wentworth had made plans. After the war, they'd open an aviation school in Scotland. Holloway would teach flying. Wentworth would handle the business side. They'd shaken hands on it the night of September 3rd, 1940, in the officers' mess, drunk on bad whiskey and good hope. Holloway died on September 4th at 2:14 a.m., not in the air, not fighting. A single Heinkel. He 111 bomber, separated from its formation, dropped its payload while fleeing back toward France. 4 250-kilogram bombs hit RAF Hornchurch's main runway. 3 created craters. The 4th detonated directly beneath Holloway's parked Spitfire. They found his logbook 70 feet away, photographs still tucked inside, Margaret and Elizabeth smiling up at the moon. Wentworth stood in the crater the next morning, smelling aviation fuel and scorched metal. Around him, ground crew filled holes with crushed stone and tar. Patch, fill, repeat. The Luftwaffe would return that night. More bombs, more craters, more dead pilots in parked aircraft. It was a pattern everyone recognized and nobody could stop. The RAF had tried everything. They dispersed aircraft across multiple airfields. The Luftwaffe simply bombed more targets. They camouflaged runways with painted grass patterns. German reconnaissance photographs saw through it by mid-August. They posted anti-aircraft batteries around every airfield. The Heinkels flew higher, at 15,000 feet above effective range. Between September 1st and September 6th, 14 more RAF pilots died on the ground at Hornchurch alone. The Luftwaffe had discovered a simple truth: pilots can't defend themselves when they're sleeping. The War Office issued Directive 347B on September 5th. All RAF fighters must be airborne during nighttime bombing raids. This created a new problem. Spitfires carried fuel for roughly 90 minutes of flight. German bombers appeared randomly throughout the night, from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. The RAF couldn't keep fighters aloft for 6 hours. Pilots would run out of fuel, crash in darkness, or return to find their own airfields cratered. On September 6th, Wentworth received orders to prepare Hornchurch for alternative runway lighting configurations should the main runway become inoperable. The instruction meant nothing. They had no alternative runways. Hornchurch was built on former farmland with exactly one strip of concrete, 400 yards long, oriented northeast-southwest to match prevailing winds. Everything else was grass, drainage ditches, and a few auxiliary buildings. That night, Wentworth couldn't sleep. He sat in the officers' quarters drinking tea, looking at reconnaissance photographs of Hornchurch taken by RAF aerial survey crews for airfield planning. The photographs showed the runway clearly, 2 parallel white lines marking the edges, clear even from 10 feet. Then he pulled out a German reconnaissance photograph, captured from a downed Dornier Do-17 in August. Same airfield, same runway. The white edge markings looked identical. At 1:30 a.m., unable to sleep, Wentworth walked out to the airfield. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to read by. He stood on empty grass, 600 yards west of the real runway, and looked up. From ground level, grass looked like grass. But from above, from 15,000 feet at night with moonlight reflecting off anything pale, he went to the maintenance shed and found a tin of white paint. Then he walked 50 yards onto the grass and painted a straight line, 6 feet long. He walked back 50 yards, looked up, squinted. The white line glowed in moonlight like a theatrical spotlight. From above, it would be unmistakable. The problem was paint. RAF Hornchurch kept perhaps 20 gallons of white paint total, barely enough to mark 100 yards of fake runway. Wentworth needed at least 400 yards, the length of a full runway, to create a convincing decoy. He'd require hundreds of gallons. Even if he requisitioned that much paint through official channels, questions would be asked. Approval would take weeks. They didn't have weeks. The Luftwaffe would return tomorrow night. At 3 a.m. on September 7th, Wentworth drove his personal automobile, a 1936 Austin 7, into the nearby town of Romford. He found a chemist shop that wouldn't open for another 5 hours. He broke the lock with a pry bar from his car trunk, left £5 sterling on the counter, and took every box of children's blackboard chalk the shop stocked. 47 boxes, each containing 12 white chalk sticks. He hit 3 more shops before dawn. By 6 a.m. he'd accumulated 183 boxes of chalk, enough to mark perhaps 800 yards if he diluted it with water. The problem wasn't just quantity, it was time. A standard RAF runway required edge markings every 50 yards, plus threshold markings, plus numbers indicating runway heading. To paint 400 yards of fake runway markings with proper spacing would take 3 men at least 8 hours. Wentworth had perhaps 12 hours before nightfall and exactly 0 official permission. He recruited 2 men from the ground crew. Corporal Dennis Metcalf, 22 from Liverpool, who'd worked as a house painter before the war, and Private Arthur Simmons, 19 from Cornwall, who'd been a fisherman. Wentworth told them the truth. This was unauthorized, possibly court-martial material, and might not work at all. Both men had known Holloway. Both men volunteered immediately. They began at 7 a.m. on September 7th, 1940. Wentworth had calculated precise measurements. The fake runway would run parallel to the real runway, exactly 600 yards west, on flat grassland that looked structurally similar from altitude. They mixed chalk powder with water in metal buckets, 4 parts chalk, 1 part water, creating a thick paste that Metcalf could apply with paint rollers salvaged from the maintenance shed. The mixture dried in sunlight within 40 minutes, but remained visible in moonlight for approximately 72 hours before rain or wind erosion would erase it. This was acceptable. Wentworth only needed it to last 1 night, maybe 2. Long enough to test whether Luftwaffe bombardiers looking through Zeiss bomb sights from 3 miles up would mistake chalk lines for concrete. The work was brutally simple but physically exhausting. Metcalf painted while Wentworth and Simmons measured distances with knotted rope. Every 50 yards, two parallel lines, 6 feet apart, running northeast-southwest, every 200 yards, perpendicular threshold markings. At the runway's north end, the numbers U8 in chalk, indicating runway heading 080 degrees, matching the real runway exactly. Station Commander Group Captain Arthur Barker discovered them at 11 a.m. He watched for 3 minutes in silence, then asked, "Flight Lieutenant, what in God's name are you doing to my grass?" Wentworth stood, chalk dust covering his uniform. "Creating a target, sir." "For the Germans?" "Yes, sir." Barker stared at the parallel chalk lines stretching across empty field. "You're painting a fake runway?" "Yes, sir." "Without authorization?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" Wentworth gestured toward the real runway 600 yards east, where 16 Spitfires sat in neat rows. "Because when the Luftwaffe comes tonight, I'd prefer they bomb grass instead of aircraft." Barker was silent for perhaps 30 seconds, then, "How long until you're finished?" 6 hours, sir. Approximately 5 p.m. "You'll be finished by 4 p.m. I'm assigning you 6 more men from ground crew. And Flight Lieutenant?" "Sir? If this doesn't work, you'll face court-martial for destruction of military property and unauthorized use of materials. If it does work, I'll pretend I authorized it from the beginning. Clear?" "Crystal, sir." By 4:17 p.m. on September 7, 1940, the fake runway was complete. From ground level, it looked absurd, white chalk lines on grass, obvious and fake. But from Barker's cockpit at 100 feet during a test flight at 4:30 p.m., the chalk glowed in late afternoon sun like fresh paint on concrete. At 5,000 feet, it was indistinguishable from the real runway except by position. At 15,000 feet, Luftwaffe bombing altitude, even Barker admitted he couldn't reliably tell which runway was genuine without prior knowledge. The final touch was lighting. Standard RAF procedure required illuminated flare path markers along runway edges during night operations. Wentworth couldn't provide actual lights. That would expose the deception too obviously. Instead, he placed 20 tin cans filled with white-painted rocks along the fake runway's length. In darkness, with moonlight reflecting off white paint, they'd resemble dim marker lights from altitude. Maybe. At 8 p.m., RAF Hornchurch received radar warning, large formation of German bombers approaching from France. Estimated arrival 11:45 p.m. Approximately 40 to 50 Heinkel, He-101s and Dornier Do-17s. All Spitfires at Hornchurch scrambled, taking off from the real runway, then diverting to forward airfields 12 miles north. By 10 p.m., RAF Hornchurch appeared abandoned. No aircraft on the ground, no visible activity. The real runway sat empty. 600 yards west, the fake runway glowed in moonlight, chalk lines bright as searchlights. At 11:43 p.m., Wentworth stood in a slit trench 200 yards south of his chalk artwork, wearing a steel helmet and carrying binoculars. Above him, the sound of Heinkel engines grew from a distant hum to a roar that shook his chest. He counted bombers by sound, 42, maybe 45 aircraft, approaching from the southeast in standard Luftwaffe formation. At 11:47 p.m., the first bombs fell. They hit the grass 150 yards north of the fake runway's threshold, close enough that Wentworth felt the concussion in his lungs. Then another stick of bombs, walking southward in neat mathematical progression, cratering the earth in 4-second intervals. Then another. The Luftwaffe bombardiers were targeting his chalk lines, dropping 250-kilogram high-explosive bombs onto empty grass. The bombing continued for 17 minutes. Wentworth counted 43 distinct impacts, all within 400 yards of the fake runway. Not one bomb fell near the real runway. Not one bomb threatened the actual airfield buildings. The Luftwaffe, flying at 14,000 feet with moonlight bright enough to read by, had mistaken children's chalk for concrete and grass for strategically vital targets. At 12:04 a.m., the bombers turned southeast, returning to occupied France. By 12:15 a.m., Group Captain Barker stood beside Wentworth in the slit trench, looking at 43 smoking craters decorating grass that had never held anything more valuable than wildflowers. Barker said, "You just saved 16 aircraft and possibly the lives of every pilot on this station." Wentworth said, "We'll need more chalk, sir. This won't survive 3 days of weather. By September 10, 1940, every RAF station in southern England knew about Wentworth's folly, the chalk runway at Hornchurch that diverted an entire Luftwaffe bombing raid. Station commanders began requesting details. How much chalk? What mixture ratio? How long did it last? What spacing for markings? The RAF initially refused to officially authorize the tactic. Directive 351A, issued September 12th, stated, "Creation of false airfield markers without express written permission from station commander constitutes misuse of materials and may confuse friendly aircraft during emergency landings." Station commanders ignored Directive 351A entirely. By September 15th, the climax of the Battle of Britain, 18 RAF airfields had created chalk-marked decoy runways. The Luftwaffe bombed all 18. 0 bombs hit actual runways. 41 German bombers dropped approximately 164 tons of high explosives onto grass, gravel paths, and one unfortunate sheep pasture. The chalk markings required maintenance. Rain washed them away, wind eroded them. Ground crews repainted every 3 days, sometimes at night between bombing raids. But the cost was minimal: chalk, water, labor. The alternative was losing aircraft, pilots, and possibly the entire air defense of Britain. German intelligence noticed the pattern by late September. Captured Luftwaffe documents from October 1940 reference Englische Scheinfliegerhorste, English false airfields. The Luftwaffe adapted by cross-referencing multiple reconnaissance photographs, timing raids for dawn rather than night, and targeting infrastructure buildings instead of runways. But the adaptation took time, nearly 4 weeks. Between September 7th and October 5th, 1940, Hereta Fighter Command lost only 32 aircraft destroyed on the ground across all of southern England. This compared to 466 aircraft lost in the previous 3 weeks. The difference, chalk lines on grass, had bought time for pilots to scramble, bought time for Britain to survive. The RAF never officially credited Wentworth for the innovation. Group Captain Barker submitted a commendation report on September 20, 1940, recommending Wentworth for recognition. The report disappeared into administrative channels at RAF High Command. No medal was awarded. No official record acknowledged the chalk runway deception as deliberate RAF policy rather than spontaneous local initiative. What the RAF did do was incorporate decoy airfields into formal doctrine. By November 1940, the Air Ministry authorized creation of Q-sites, elaborate false airfields complete with wooden aircraft, painted runway markings, and remote-controlled lighting systems designed to draw Luftwaffe bombs away from real installations. These Q-sites were technically sophisticated, expensive, and effective. None of the official documentation mentioned that the entire concept began with a logistics officer, 3 boxes of children's chalk, and desperate improvisation on grass. Peter Wentworth remained at RAF Hornchurch until June 1941, when he transferred to North Africa as airfield engineer for operations in Egypt. He never flew combat missions. He never shot down enemy aircraft. He spent the war repairing runways, filling bomb craters, and occasionally painting false markings on sand when German reconnaissance flights appeared overhead. After the war, Wentworth returned to Nettlebed, Oxfordshire. He took over his father's printing shop in 1947. He married a local schoolteacher named Dorothy Finch in 1948. They had 2 children, a son born in 1950, a daughter in 1952. Wentworth ran the printing shop until 1973, producing wedding invitations, church bulletins, and local newspaper advertisements. He never spoke publicly about the chalk runways. In 1987, a military historian named Dr. Colin Atkinson, researching RAF defensive tactics during the Battle of Britain, found a reference to improvised decoy runway markings in a footnote of Group Captain Arthur Barker's personal diary, donated to the Imperial War Museum. Atkinson tracked down surviving records from RAF Hornchurch and identified Wentworth as the likely originator of the tactic. Atkinson interviewed Wentworth by telephone in March 1988. Wentworth was 74 years old, living in the same house in Nettlebed where he'd grown up. When Atkinson asked about the chalk runways, Wentworth said, "It seemed obvious at the time. The Germans were looking for runways. We gave them runways, just not the ones they wanted. Atkinson asked if Wentworth felt bitter about the lack of official recognition. Wentworth said, "Recognition wasn't the point. Holloway's daughter got to grow up with a country worth living in. That was the point." Peter Wentworth died on November 14, 1992, at age 78, from pneumonia following a respiratory infection. His obituary in the Henley Standard newspaper mentioned his service with RAF Fighter Command during the war, but included no details. The obituary focused primarily on his 45 years operating the printing shop and his contributions to the local parish council. In 1995, the RAF Museum at Hendon opened a small exhibit on deception and decoy operations 1940-1945. The exhibit included photographs of Q sites, descriptions of dummy aircraft construction, and technical schematics of remote-controlled lighting systems. A single placard, added in 2003 following Dr. Atkinson's research, mentioned initial field experiments with false runway markings were conducted at RAF Hornchurch in September 1940, contributing to the development of systematic decoy airfield programs. The placard did not mention Wentworth's name. In 2018, their commemorative bench was installed at RAF Hornchurch Heritage Centre, the site of the former airfield, now converted to playing fields and community gardens. The bench bears a plaque, "In memory of all personnel who served at RAF Hornchurch, 1928-1962. Their innovation and courage defended Britain's skies." If you walk 600 yards west from that bench, across grass now used for Sunday football matches, you'll find nothing but open field. No marker, no memorial. No indication that in September 1940, children's chalk and human ingenuity stopped 400 Luftwaffe bombers from destroying the aircraft that won the Battle of Britain. But if you look at the ground on a bright night when the moon is 3/4 full, and if you know exactly where to look, sometimes you can still see faint white lines in the grass where Flight Lieutenant Peter Wentworth, 26 years old, 5'7", from a printing shop in Oxfordshire, drew a runway that existed only in moonlight and saved a nation by giving the enemy exactly what they were looking for, just not where they expected to find it. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that history is built by ordinary people making extraordinary decisions in impossible circumstances, then hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep sharing these forgotten stories. And drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if your grandfather served. Tell us if you've ever visited RAF Hornchurch or any Battle of Britain airfield. These stories survive only if people like you care enough to share them. Thank you for keeping Peter Wentworth's memory alive.